introduce Let me introduce you then to our speaker this evening. We're really delighted that we've got Mathew Frith joining us. His talk is called Wet, Dry and Wild. So it's an intriguing title, Managing Our City Better for Nature in a Time of Climate Instability. And Mathew Frith is really well placed to give a talk on this particular subject. He's currently Director of Conservation at the London Wildlife Trust. He's actually been in that position for a long time, and I think involved with the London Wildlife Trust itself for even longer. He has over 30 years experience in urban nature conservation and the green space sector. He's worked with the public and the voluntary sector, promoting the value of urban nature and the benefits of high quality green spaces. So I'm going to pass you over to him now. Over to you, Mathew, and we're delighted that you're joining us this evening.
Thank you, Maria, and good evening, everybody. I've got a fair few slides to rush through, so I'll try and be as snappy as possible, bearing in mind the time. Maria's already given an introduction to myself, but just a little bit about the London Wildlife Trust, if you're not familiar with us at all. We're about 40 years old, so we're much younger than yourselves. And we are one of 46 wildlife trusts working throughout the UK. And as you'll probably be aware, we operate within Greater London, but we were the last of the sort of home county trusts to be formed and work therefore closely with our neighbouring wildlife trusts, some of whom still operate within their old counties of Essex and Middlesex, etc. But we are increasingly working together across the country as a kind of federation rather than the sort of 46 autonomous organisations. Now, London, which you'll all be very familiar with, is a remarkably green city in terms of its kind of green and blue cover. Figures vary between 47% and 49%, depending who you believe. But it means that, you know, the city is already well advanced in terms of how it may be able to combat an increasingly unstable climate, given the kind of challenges ahead. You know, given that COP27 over in Egypt at the moment is focusing the minds perhaps of some world leaders, but those of us living and working in cities are feeling some of these impacts probably far more acutely than elsewhere in the country. Now, London's nature conservation assets, which the LNHS and others have been working digitally to protect, conserve, understand, promote, etc., over many, many decades, are kind of encapsulated in the sites of importance for nature conservation. These cover about 20% of the land area of London. But they, of course, are not the only assets. And of course, as Liz was going through her sort of list of species recorded recently, there is a surprisingly large number of fungi, fauna and flora found in Greater London, data of which mostly resides on green space information for Greater London. But this is often a great surprise to politicians and people who are not really familiar with our world, that we share our city with this diversity. You know, London is often perceived a place for pigeons, rats and foxes, but once you start delving into the detail, it is absolutely magical. And obviously, organisations like the LNHS, London Wildlife Trust, are doing our best to conserve this diversity and enhance it where appropriate. Now, coming into climate change, you know, as you'll be fully aware, there's been this long-standing debate of whether there's some of the extreme events that we've experienced over the last 100 years are evidence of a changing climate, or that we've always had these extreme events which have kind of made milestones into our lives and have had an impact on the natural environment. So 1947, the heavy winter between January and March, I was lucky to get hold of some papers of a young boy who was recording the birds of Dulwich during that winter, and that was published in the London Bird Report a couple of years ago, looking at the implications of that winter on those bird populations. Coming forward a few decades, 1976, the hot summer, I was old enough to remember that, and still an extreme weather event of some kind. And then in 1987, by the time London Wildlife Trust was born, we were dealing, like many other landowners and managers, with the impacts of the Great Storm, followed again in 1990. And then we've had increasing numbers of flood events, 2005 being one such example. And then this year, we've had record temperatures through a prolonged heat wave at the end of July, and then also drought, which is still officially, I think, still official from Thames Water. So this is one of our nature reserves in Bexley going up in flames. And we had two other sites which caught light, Guttridge Woods in Hillingdon and Bramley Bank, which forms the main picture, which is on the edge of the Addington Hills in Croydon. Now, I'm not a climate scientist. My job at the Trust is partly to sort of try and track what's going on in the world of climate change and climate resilience and climate adaptation. But these are some of the climate change projections from the 1971 to 2000 baseline, showing what we're expecting to experience as citizens of London, and how that also may affect our natural systems which we share our city with. So, I mean, to cut a long story short, I'm sure you're familiar with this, we're going to be expecting to see warmer, drier summers, warmer, milder, wetter winters, and greater frequency and extremity of intense weather events, whether they are storms, whether they are heat waves, whether they're drought, whether they're flash floods, etc. And that is something which we're beginning to experience. So this is just a set of incidents that the Greater London Authority presented at a meeting I attended a few weeks back, just showing over the last 22 years, in some ways, an increasing number of events which are above the average that we would normally be expecting to experience. And it's fair to say that those numbers, you know, that list only goes up to 2022, but if it was to extend to 2029, it will probably be a longer list than the previous decade. And we're seeing increased amounts of flooding, increased amounts of heat waves. And of course, this is exacerbated in London by the urban heat island. So if, you know, the albedo effect in terms of the extreme amount of dark, solid surfaces in the city, the disproportionate lack of green space and open water is having an impact in increasing the number of, you know, the amount of heat that resides over the city, almost like an island. In high summer, the difference between, say, Charing Cross and the very edge of Barnet or the edge of Bromley is often 10 degrees centigrade. I'm not quite sure what the difference was this summer, but it's something that I'm going to find out to see whether that has changed or not. But again, it is very, very significant. And that's partly going to be, has been made worse, as whilst I was talking about 47% green at the outset, you know, there's a lot of change occurring in London that has happened in the last 20 years in particular. And one particular typology, for want of a better word, is that of our gardens. We've got 3.2 million garden plots across London from the last kind of detailed survey in 2008-9, and they're gradually going from green to grey, primarily because of controlled parking zones, people's desire to have simple spaces which are easy to keep tidy and to extend their outdoor space into gardens. So we lost 3,000 hectares between the period of 1998-9 and 2006-7, which is equivalent to about 2.5 Hyde Parks each year. And in the same period, 1 million trees were disappeared as well. So this is from aerial survey comparisons, and that was published in a report back in 2010, something which we are keen to get updated in terms of influencing planning policy into the future. Now, this urban heat island effect map also shows some of the kind of mitigating impacts of some of our larger open spaces. And whilst I didn't necessarily pick out this particularly because of Hampstead Heath, you'll see here the impacts of Hampstead Heath, Richmond Park and Wimbledon Common in making the areas slightly cooler to the northeast of those open spaces, given the impacts of the prevailing winds from the southwest. And they can see that further impacted by the water bodies in the Lee Valley and to some extent Epping Forest. So we know, it's not rocket science that green spaces, woodlands in particular, provide opportunities to cool the city. And in some ways, that's a driver for current policy in London, particularly in terms of the London Environment Strategy, which has got an objective to make more than half of London green by 2050, and conserving and enhancing wildlife and natural habitats. There's also commitments to improve the greenery cover within the inner city, given that's going to experience even greater temperature extremes if our current climate projections are met. Now, there's been numerous kind of strategies to try and deliver these kind of greener ambitions. The most recent that was published in terms of the London plan was the All London Green Grid, a fairly clunky title. And for those of us with a biodiversity perspective, perhaps not quite as ecologically robust as it might have been, but nevertheless, it was trying to meet a whole range of objectives in terms of climate change adaptation, air and water quality, people's amenity, landscape value, food provision, etc., etc. There was a commitment under the London Plan published in 2021 to review this. I would probably suggest that might be overtaken by some commitments in the Environment Act. However, the Mayor has undertaken quite a lot of work through the Greater London Authority and a number of other organisations in mapping the ecological assets that we've got in the city. So if you go through to Mapping London, which is the database which is managed by the GLA, we have an up-to-date tree canopy cover map. I sourced this only yesterday. So from that, we've got 21% of London is supposedly covered in trees, which is about the same cover as the amount of sites of importance for nature conservation. There is a commitment. Sorry, this is you can focus down in the resolution. So this is Hampstead Heath and the surrounds here, showing how much of this is mapped going straight into gardens and along streets, as well as into parks and open spaces. And there's a more precise commitment which is now set out in the London Urban Forest Plan, published almost 2 years ago, which has got a commitment to increase canopy cover to 23% by 2050. That's actually quite difficult if you actually start delving into where trees can be planted or where woodlands are being allowed to generate through their own natural processes. So you'll be familiar, there's a whole range of tree planting programs that have been delivered over the last 20, 30 years, ever since those storms of 87 and 1990. But there is kind of increased urgency through the need to sort of make our green spaces more resilient for climate. And this is not just a London programme, this is a national programme as well. So DEFRA is putting money into increased canopy cover. Yes, from a London Wildlife Trust perspective, we will do planting where we think it's not going to have an impact on biodiversity for example, some of the acidic grasslands that Liz was talking about, we are still experiencing some tree planting going on those kinds of habitats because those with good intentions don't necessarily recognise what they're planting. So there's a role that we're playing on the London Urban Forest Partnership to try and make sure that it's the right place before you put in the right tree for the right reason. And what we would prefer is for nature to do her own thing. So this is just the site that we manage up in East Barnet, Oak Hill Park. We manage the woodland. And over the course of the last 15, 20 years, we've been allowing the jays and wind to do their own thing. And that woodland is now extending across into a relatively poor quality grassland. Now, local authorities and other organisations are beginning to probably step up their kind of integrated approach, bringing together biodiversity commitments with what I would call green infrastructure commitments, trying to meet multiple objectives, whether I said it's biodiversity conservation, whether it's landscape scale conservation, whether it's public amenity, the quality of their parks, and in terms of climate change adaptation. And that's been given some additional kind of boost by some of the commitments under the Environment Act, which received royal assent last year. And I'll touch on a bit of that later. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, whilst it's quite easy to criticise many local authorities for not playing their part, and many of our open spaces and parks could be a lot better, we've witnessed over the last 20 years, particularly since the kind of advocacy of what was the Urban Parks Forum during the 1990s, a revolution in many of our parks in terms of their quality. A lot of that through funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund and other sources, but parks have become a lot better in many parts of the city, and some of them, I'm pleased to say, have become very much wilder. And there is generally now no real need to push on the door to these kind of park designs and park proposals to make sure that they embed nature into their designs and into their management. As always, it's a balance between amenity needs, management resources, etc., etc. And for my own sins, one of my local parks is Crystal Palace Park, which has been through quite a few years of real challenges. It's a huge park with a lot of historic heritage, which is valuable, but also it is surrounded by 5 boroughs, and so in some ways suffers from the kind of edge impacts by nobody really wanting to sort of take control of it. But there's now a Crystal Palace Parks Trust, which is looking to take on the management of the site from spring next year. And biodiversity is part and parcel of those discussions. But perhaps there are needs for some bolder transformations. So this was a car park which was basically providing space for Heathrow, which the London Wildlife Trust took on through some land swaps between Hillingdon and Hounslow in earlier that decade. And within the course of a couple of years, we were able to transform that into an extension, what is called Huckabee's Meadows, which is a site to the south of this site, which was in fact relic countryside, which came into our hands in 1994. And over the course of the last decade, we've been slowly improving that and introducing grazing. However, it is right by the River Crane, and many of our rivers in London are subject to significant pressures from pollution, from encroachment, from the legacy of concretisation that occurred from the 1950s, 60s and 70s as engineers tried to get the water from the rivers into the Thames as quickly as possible, because that was perceived to be the way that you dealt with potential flooding. So those sewage spillovers and the work that's been undertaken, particularly by ZSL through outfall safaris across many river catchments, we're picking up just how much of a legacy our river systems are dealing with in terms of poor water quality. Thankfully, through the work of the Water Framework Directive, question mark over whether that will survive the current legislation going through Parliament, but there is commitment through that to try and address water quality through our rivers, through the various catchment plans in London and the Thames Basin River Management Plan. And this is also tied in with the river flood risk that London faces. I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can see from this map that significant parts of the city are affected by potential flood. And whilst the Thames Barrier has been doing a good job ever since the 1980s, there's already talk of having to create a new barrier in due course to deal with not only the kind of flood risk from surface water flooding upstream, but also rising sea level through climate change and the melting of the Arctic waters. Sorry, the Arctic ice sheets. So many organisations have been doing work to try and increase the resilience and improve the resilience of our rivers. So this is the River Crane on the site that I just showed you at Huckabee's Meadows, and we were able to dig out that route. This is in 2013, reconnecting it to the main river. So it started flowing again in January 2014, but because the riverbank was so enriched, of course, the Himalayan balsam returned. But we're beginning to get the beginnings of a new system, a more naturalised system in place. Further upstream in the London Borough of Hillingdon at Gutteridge Wood, we have a straightened channel of the Yedding Brook, and by introducing deflectors and introducing gravel beds, we start changing the morphology of the river to help encourage species to return to what was a very kind of fast and simplified river system. On the River Brent, we are narrowing some channels here and revegetating them to quicken, again, the river in some parts, but to slow it down in others. This gives opportunities for a range of fauna and flora to naturally colonise, and particularly important to improve the quality of the water for enabling fish species to migrate and be able to spawn here. Yeah, given that many of these rough rivers have suffered what was called flash flooding and spate, pushing them out of the river system into the Thames, by slowing those rivers down, quickening them up in certain spaces, it gives the ability for fish to migrate upstream, none more so than eels, and there's been a lot of work done over the last 20 years to try and reduce the barriers for eels moving upstream. Here I'm going to quick examples here of another culvertised stream in the Maesbrook in Barking. This is what it looked in 2019, not helped, of course, by the kind of lack of management that's going on, but through dedicated work by the London Rivers Restoration Trust at that time, London Wildlife Trust, the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, we were able to naturalize that. And that's just one example of some amazing work that's been going on across London. Another example, the overflowing Pims Brook, which feeds into the Lee at Edmonton, flowing through Oak Hill Park in East Barnet. Showed you a picture of the natural woodland. The Oak Hill Wood is on the left-hand side there, but this Pims Brook was always overflowing and often just leaving a pool that became stagnant and smelly and unpopular with the site users. So through the Environment Agency, we received consent to break out a tributary to the Pims Brook that flowed through Oak Hill Wood in a tunnel, and often was receiving quite a lot of pollution. And we were able to break that out, reprofile a new course, create a new kind of a backwater, which would hold backwater if needs be. And then following a year, this was what was created. You can see a grey heron there in the middle distance, but a site which was already becoming less stagnant and beginning to improve in terms of its floodwater resilience and in terms of its biodiversity. Another example undertaken by Thames 21, Thames Water and Enfield Council was at Firs Farm Wetlands. 30,000 cubic meter capacity there in terms of flood water. What was that created from? That was created from what we call a green desert and an abandoned sports pitch. Elsewhere in Thamesmead, which has got a canal system, there's not much you can do to break out of that. So you soften the edges with choir beds, which you plant up with reeds, or you can put in floating islands in their particular lakes, again, providing additional resource for pollinators. And underneath these floating reed beds, of course, refuges as nurseries for fish. But what about housing estate deserts, where often there's less space to do major things with, but also the potential for sites which are going to be infill development? They become vulnerable to development because they seem unwanted, uncared for, and of little particular purpose. But through dedicated work by certain organisations, groundwork here in Hammersmith and Fulham, London Wildlife Trust here in London Borough Lambeth, it's about turning these places into a purpose. So planting rain gardens, and here in Thamesmead, creating new landscapes of resilience. So these sites begin to have a purpose. They're no longer green deserts with no particular value to people or to biodiversity. And then you can take that into the fabric of the road. So this is a bit of work that we're doing in Loughborough Junction. And then no surprise to you all, I'm sure, up into the sky with the green roof renaissance that has happened in London over the last 25 years. An example of a project that has been tying these various bits and pieces together is the Wild West End, kicked off by the Crown Estate, which owns Regent Street, but also the Grosvenor Estate, the Howard Warden Estate, etc., Shaftesbury, working with Arup, London Wildlife Trust and others, starting to get an understanding how biodiversity navigates itself through this very, very hard part of the West End, but also starting to install green roofs, create a network of green pop-up green sites, bits of the street which are turning into sustainable urban drainage systems, etc. Now, in terms of green roofs, the Mayor of London in 2009 published a policy to encourage green roofs in the city, and the report published in 2019 was looking back at what had happened in the 10 years, and that showed that 163 hectares had been created over that 10-year period. This is an example in Aldwych, which the Trust helped to design, a place called Goodman's Fields. But when I was up there taking this photograph, there were wren, blackbird, starling, goldfinch. Just to give you an example, with the right habitat and the right situation, they can start to provide real valid stepping stones. But of course, some of our city is not going to be escaping periods of heat waves. This is Huckabee's Meadows again, out, as I said, near Cranford. This summer, completely parched. And there are going to be species which are going to be less able to tolerate these extreme conditions, whether they're ferns or mosses or liverworts or lichens. Heat also exacerbates air pollution. This is Ramalina fraxinia, which is found on one of our sites down in Croydon at Hutchinson's Bank. And it seems to be a species which is particularly dependent on clean air. But in periods of heat waves, will that disappear? We don't know at the moment. But again, it's a driver for trying to sort of look at how we can make our estates, our landscapes more and more resilient. And then Liz talked about the bog at Kenwood. This is Farm Bog on Wimbledon Common, which we manage on behalf of the Conservatives, one of the largest mires in the city, in Greater London. But it's already beginning to dry out. So how do we address that without sort of abstracting the water from boreholes? London is already in an area where there is a significant amount of abstraction, and at times it is drier than parts of the Sahara. So again, posing big challenges for us. This site supports veilwort, regionally uncommon. could this disappear? And then jumping straight into perhaps a more contentious area is we are a city which has got high proportion of invasive species, both native and non-native. And if we're doing works in our rivers and watercourses in particular, we run the risk of encouraging unintentionally the spread of particular species which are not necessarily helpful to our conservation aims. And I'm not going to go into these in any kind of detail, but you'll be familiar with floating pennywort, water fern, New Zealand stonecrop and parrot's feather as just some examples. But then we also have a range of fauna such as zebra mussel, quagga mussel, signal crayfish, devil shrimp, killer shrimp, Chinese mitten crab, etc., etc. These aquatic species are particularly difficult to control or eradicate if we so wish, because we can't really do that without destroying the other fauna and flora they cohabit these particular watercourses with. And then we've also got those species which are affecting our trees, partly down to the lack of biosecurity, one would argue, from the horticultural trade, but also through the globalization of and the global connectivity with Britain and the rest of the world. So the horse chestnuts that we've seen change colour over the summers since 2002, they're part and parcel of London's biota, and perhaps in time they are sort of birds and other invertebrate predators might find that they would start to control those, perhaps still early days. And as organisations, we perhaps have a role in managing some of the media alarmism that comes in with some of these non-natives, which may affect us, so Asian hornet, for example. But do we welcome new migrants that might appear, like map butterfly? Is climate change going to make things arrive from our shores from across the Channel, which arguably things like sycamore did anyway before the English Channel cut them off from mainland Europe? Or perhaps more excitingly, do we embrace old friends? Otters are now present in every county in the UK, and it become no surprise to yourselves that they are breeding in London yet again. There is a certain nervousness about informing people where they are, because our angling friends don't particularly like them because of their propensity to eat what they cherish. But this is just a shot from one of our nature reserves, from some of our remote camera sensing, and they're found on about 3 of our reserves at the moment. And then, of course, we've got growing deer populations, perhaps not here because of climate change per se, but if we're increasing the amount of canopy cover, are we providing habitat which is particularly of value to deer, whether it's muntjac, fallow, red or roe? We've got all 4 species alive and kicking and wild in London, bringing with them potential impacts from deer vehicle collisions, eating people's strawberries in their gardens, browsing away the flora from woodlands. If you want to go and see a devastated ancient woodland, go to Dagenham Park in the London Borough of Havering. And then perhaps wild boar. If I was giving this presentation 5 years ago, I'd said it'd be another 10 years before we see boar in London, but I've seen evidence of wild boar in the London Borough of Bromley, and there was a report of one in the London Borough of Ealing. Those of you on the call might say, well, we've got reports on the Hampstead Heath. I don't know, but they're going to be here very, very shortly. Which brings me to the sort of final part of my presentation, which is the whole element of rewilding. Some of you may have seen this in The Guardian last December, upon the announcement of the Rewild London Fund, which the Trust is working with the Greater London Authority on. And there was the first tranche of that launched last year, which some of the media rather twisted to say that beavers are going to be reintroduced into Hyde Park. That wasn't quite the intention, and I'm not going to bore you with the details of how that got transformed into that kind of idea. But beavers are the flavour of the month, and the Mayor convened a Rewild London task force, which I'm lucky enough to be a member of. And we are currently coming to the end of our work, trying to work out what rewilding in London might mean, looking to publish a set of rewilding principles that might apply to London, given that the term rewilding seems to apply to anything from your lifestyle to the food you eat to the clothes you wear, let alone to what you do in your garden or in your balcony, let alone what might be happening to parts of the uplands in Scotland and Wales, where we're hearing talk about reintroducing lynx, for example. So it's a very broad spectrum, and the work of the task force is to try and narrow that down to something that is meaningful. But you'll be aware that there are already, well, there's now one beaver in the London Borough of Enfield. A pair were introduced into an enclosure through work with Enfield and Capel Manor College earlier in the year to sort of pilot how they would operate. This follows from work that various wildlife trusts have done up and down the country. So Kent over at Ham Fen near Sandwich, Devon undertaking quite a lot of work with the University of Exeter in North Devon, and also monitoring the wild population on the River Otter. And it's something, there is now a dedicated London Beaver Working Group, which we are part of, and investigating various sites where there possibly could be looked at as pilot introductions. Perhaps more realistic is ventures into large-scale rewilding schemes. Now, Enfield have already taken a step forward with this, with their large-scale afforestation in Trent Park and Enfield Chase. They're lucky enough to be owners of large amount of farmland in the Greenbelt. Probably no other London borough enjoys that kind of opportunity. There's work you could argue that Thames Chase Trust have been doing in the London Borough of Havering and over into Thurrock and Epping district councils, and on the edge of London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, as a community forest that kind of came out of the legacy of the work of the government after the 1987 Great Storm. And they've been slowly sort of foresting bits and pieces of that landscape as and when land becomes available. But Enfield Council own much of their greenbelt. And through the kind of work they've started over the last 2 years, they're starting a massive piece of afforestation, and they've just received a grant from DEFRA, one of the landscape scale recovery grants, one of the 22 schemes granted in England in the last couple of months. And we've been talking to them about how that might look and what that might mean for biodiversity in London, because this is something that could be looked at again in other parts of the city, and more importantly, cross-boundary, rather than thinking within Greater London per se, looking at the connectivity into Surrey, into Kent, into Essex, into Hertfordshire, into Buckinghamshire, into Berkshire. Many of this will be on, much of this will be on landscape scale recovery approaches that organisations like the RSPB and the Wildlife Trusts have tried to set out and conceived in the past. So the Living Landscapes and Wildlife Trust produced in 2008. But the Trust is already beginning to take this forward in terms of a local nature recovery plan. One of the commitments through the Environment Act of 2021 to produce a nature recovery strategy for England and a nature recovery network. Now, as expected, the Greater London Authority will be producing a local nature recovery strategy for London, but many local authorities in London are already starting work on their plans. We were lucky enough to be brought in by Hackney last year to develop what a plan might look like for a particular London borough. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this because that would take a whole nother talk, but we're starting to look how certain birds, how certain bats might utilize particular corridors as stepping stones, and that's starting to frame how that network would look. We're already taking that approach through a project that's just finished called Brilliant Butterflies on some other chalk grassland sites in the south of London, and these are just some of the examples that we've been working on. But finally, we can't lose sight of the fact that we share our city not only with wildlife, but with people. And the fires that occurred in London this year, as you saw in Rainham, in the London Borough of Havering, a number of homes went up in flames. So that we've now got this tension that the London Fire Brigade has raised that, do we have long grass, which we like for wildlife and manage for biodiversities and climate change adaptation, etc., close to where people's homes are? And there's some difficult decisions that might need to be made. And then perhaps on an up note, we need to make sure that it's easy to be diverted by beavers, by potentially megafauna, longhorn cattle, conic ponies, etc. They're all ecosystem engineers, but let's not lose sight of the small. There's some brilliant small species which are easily overlooked, which we could do with having more of. These are just some examples, whether it's glowworms, water shrew, streaked bombardier, or narrow-leaved water dropwort. They're holding on in very small patches in London, but there could be work to make sure that they have a chance into the future of London's nature. Thank you very much. I'm drying up, so I need a break. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating talk, Matthew. And I'm just going to let you have a little drink and before we go on to asking any questions. So just kind of have a little bit of time to recover. But how fascinating. I thought you kind of really covered so many of the different issues that need to be kind of thought about, some of the kind of real threats that wildlife, that the environment is facing. I mean, the loss of garden plots, for example, a couple of people have commented in the chat about particular examples of where that's happened. Particularly the pressures that are on the rivers, issues around sewage and the kind of ways that those rivers have been managed in the past. So a whole lot of kind of issues that need thinking about. It was also really positive to see all the kind of projects that are happening, the ways that kind of river management is improving, the quality of what's happening in parks, which are such an important kind of part of the environment in a city like London. So I thought the cover, the amount that you covered in such a short space of time was really very impressive. So thank you very much for that. We will go on to questions in a minute, but I did just want to sort of say about rewilding, that's something we've particularly been kind of interested in and discussing as an organisation. And so it's really positive to hear about, the forthcoming publication of the work that's been done by the London Task Force, the Rewilding London Task Force. That's certainly something that as a society will be particularly interested in having a look at. Do we have an idea about when that might be available, what the sort of timescale is for that?
Yes, we had a meeting actually on Tuesday, and the current timetable is that the Mayor wants to publish a set of principles that he can flag up at COP15, which is in the middle of December.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to Montreal, thankfully, in terms of carbon footprint. But there is going to be a session on cities sometime. I can't remember the date that is due to be. And I think he's doing that. He's currently the president of the group of C40 cities. So these are 40 cities around the world that are particularly taking steps on issues of sustainability, etc. So yes, the idea is to produce a set of principles, and we're currently looking at those at the moment. And then the report is likely to be launched in February. And this will tie in with the announcement of what I didn't mention is, whilst there was a tranche 1 of the Rewild London Fund last year, tranche 2 was announced in October. And we're likely to announce the recipients of those funds in February, and at the same time the report will be launched at the same time as that.
That's brilliant. Okay, really looking forward to that reading. And that, I think, you know, again, it's a very unclear term, I think, to many people. What, you know, as you sort of mentioned, what does actually rewilding mean, and what would it mean in terms of London? But it's a kind of, you know, buzzword of the moment that I think everybody would, you know, wants to get their head around, and potentially is a kind of way of moving things forward in a positive direction. So we're really interested to see that. I'm going to go over now to Anchor, because I know there's quite a few questions and comments, interesting questions and comments that come through the chat. So would you like to pick up a couple of things to ask Mathew now, Anchor?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few questions. I mean, many people are just kind of commenting, particularly about the kind of paving over of front gardens for driveways and drop curbs and stuff, which I've seen a lot where I live, and it's shocking. And then, of course, when there's rain, there's a lot of flooding. So Jeff was asking, from all of the plans mentioned, it does not appear that targets for gains are being tempered by predicted losses of habitat and biodiversity due to climate change. So who is measuring that, and what form would you say these losses will take?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I mean, just on the issue of is a simple answer. So I did mention that we were members of the London Urban Forest Partnership, and I know that I still keep trying to get the GLA to get LNHS representation on the Green Infrastructure Partnership, just to show that there's a number of kind of overlapping groupings that don't necessarily integrate as well as they should do. But in terms of the London Urban Forest Partnership, there's always this kind of talk about how many trees have been planted. And then we say, yeah, but we've taken these number of trees down because they're encroaching on heathland, or they're encroaching on chalk grassland. So in terms of trying to restore chalk grassland for their orchids or their butterflies or their crickets, etc., we're taking this amount of trees down. But nobody wants to measure that, because it means that the political side of it is not such a great number, because they've planted 10,000, but actually the net gain is 5,000. And then the question is, have they been in the right places for the right reason, kind of stuff. I think there's also, it's very difficult to predict what the impacts of losses will be. We still don't really know. I mean, there's been quite a lot of modelling work done. And again, I think the biodiversity conservation sector is often well ahead of others in terms of the monarch modelling that was undertaken by CEH and English Nature, as was back in 2000, 2002, looking at what the likely impacts were going to be in terms of habitats and species. And there's been some more recent work undertaken by Natural England, but trying to quantify that, I think, is really, really difficult. So it's not perhaps the best answer. I think it's recognizing that some of these things are challenging. And it's even more, the other kind of rewilding element to this, and this is something which I find, dare I say it, rather wryly amusing, is we've got a great kind of push from some quarters to get biodiversity net gain as a metric, as a model in place. And then people saying, well, can we apply that to rewilding? Well, no, they're completely two philosophically opposing ideas, because rewilding is you basically just step away and let nature do her own thing. You could argue there's a set of things you put in place and then you step off. Biodiversity net gain is about measuring, monitoring and predicting, and then trying to ensure that you get your score of 10% uplift within a particular time frame. Rewilding is just letting go. And that's something that is, I think, interesting at this moment in time. We're seeing these two almost counter philosophies, because biodiversity net gain is looking at predictive approaches to achieving nature conservation gains. I understand the reason why, and I, at some level, I have an understanding why biodiversity net gain has been put in place as a model, because arguably many of the previous approaches didn't work. But I still think many people are trying to hang too much onto it. It's just a tool to inform decisions. Sorry, I went off on an aside there. You caught me on something.
That's really interesting, actually, because we've kind of, it's interesting to see about there's maybe some different sort of underlying thinking, and there are perhaps some this sort of philosophical differences. It's interesting to see about, is this sort of common ground, and what is there something that's beyond both that we kind of ought to be aiming for? But it is I thought that was very thought-provoking, and something that perhaps I hadn't kind of personally considered very much before, and I want to kind of go away and think about that now. So I'm glad you went off on a little tangent, because I think that was really interesting. Anka, I'll go back to you now.
Well, there's kind of a related question, sort of in letting go. So Kennedy was wondering if you could comment on bramble management, and whether the chop of bramble patches is appropriate or not, often in January, February, just before bird nesting. So any comments on that?
Yeah. I love bramble. I just think bramble is an amazing plant. But it's also very, very invasive, and it grows very, very quickly. And it's always, to me, the bottom line in all of this is all about context. Certainly, we shouldn't be piling into vegetation where we know birds and other species might be roosting or nesting. We shouldn't be doing that anyway. So common sense applies. But if you've got large areas of, say, important habitat which are being encroached by bramble, then arguably one takes steps to try and reduce that extent, so you can get that more important habitat. Perhaps single monoculture of bramble eventually becomes just a very, very woody, dense patch with very little underneath it. Yes, the surface will provide some flowering and berries for benefit birds and some mammals, but underneath it becomes too dense. So it's horses for courses, it's context. But certainly, our advice would be that if you think of doing any kind of habitat cutting back, then it really shouldn't be at a time when birds are beginning to start their breeding behaviour. That, the legislation doesn't say thou shalt not, but it does suggest that you shouldn't.
I think there was also a comment, wasn't there, about maybe having some really kind of clear guidelines. Somebody sort of said, they were kind of, thinking about the bramble as well, and perhaps it's not particularly clear to people about, when, and perhaps the idea about the kind of context. So maybe there is a kind of case for having some clearer information for people, so that, these kind of, where people are, you think some of these things will be common sense, but possibly they're not, it's not always obvious to everybody, particularly when there's a bit of, there's kind of advantages and disadvantages in doing something. So I don't know whether that's something that you would be able to produce, but I think it seems like that could be something that could be helpful to people who are involved in managing various sites.
That is a good point, and perhaps I was a little bit flippant in saying common sense. I didn't mean that in a kind of pejorative way. I think it's something that I'm increasingly encountering, and you could argue that one of the successes of the nature conservation sector in all its many ways has got over this sense that birds breed during a particular time of the year, and so therefore there was this legislation under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, but we are told increasingly that you shouldn't do that between March and August because birds will nest there. The legislation doesn't say that, and the guidance doesn't really say that, but it's actually quite complicated. As you say, it generally requires a little bit of understanding to work out what's going on in any particular area. And you're going to have to, it's one of those things that, this is where I go back onto biodiversity net gain. You can't really replace a metric or a kind of aerial photograph with an informed naturalist or ecologist who knows what they're talking about, who can understand what they're looking at and can make an informed judgment on something. And that applies just as much to land management as it does to making a planning decision. And obviously the sector has got professionalized over the last few years, and there are sort of many, and I use the term in the best meaning, the amateur naturalists are highly experienced and highly expert, often not involved in some of those decisions for various reasons. But yeah, I mean, I'll take that back because I think it's something we're encountering quite a lot. This simple view that you can't do any work in any site between March and August because birds are breeding and you might affect them. Well, it really depends, again, the context, the site in question, what you're doing, etc., etc.
I just wanted to kind of jump in there because I really take to heart the point about that amateur natural historians are not, and the ecologists are not being included in a lot of decision making, a lot of planning. And I think it's something that these people should be included because they often know particular sites better than anyone else. And I'm just, do you think that there's space for people, amateurs to be included in these planning sessions?
Well, my personal view is yes. I think even my professional view is yes. I think the question is, how would they get the profile where they're taken in, their views are taken as legitimate points of view? Because I think, I'm just looking at the other side of the wall. Local planners, they've had complete, cut to the bone over the last 12 years. Very few planners have any kind of ecological understanding at all. All birds nesting in trees kind of thing, the idea of birds nesting on the ground, that kind of thing. I'm not really, being a bit flippant there, but I mean, I just think that the ecological knowledge within local planning authorities is very poor. And even we have a struggle getting kind of acknowledged and our points taken on, because you're finding you're having to write quite detailed information, and you can almost think after paragraph 3 you've lost them. But you need to be able to if it's a particular planning issue which goes to an appeal or to public inquiry, then you're going to have to stand in the dock and present your evidence and be challenged by the appellant or the developer. So that's something I'm going to ask my fellow wildlife trusts that, because I want to know what, I'm part of a planning group across the wildlife trusts, and we meet monthly to talk about various issues. It's generally what the government is throwing us all the time. But I can ask that. Yeah, I'll ask how they involve their local natural history societies in information, whether it's in forward planning or whether it's in development control. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
And we might have just time, I don't know, if one or two quick more questions, if there's anything else left in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, there's two questions that I'm going to combine into one because they're kind of related. So they come from Colin over at Heath Hands, and also JK, who's one of our very loyal viewers here. So Colin was saying, that he read with interest the French government have legislated that all large car parks must be covered in solar panels. And then JK has said that we have land use regulations which are making paving over a percentage of development and residential land illegal in Germany. So, I mean, can you see these being interventions or options here in the UK?
I think we'll get there. I think the UK government has dragged its feet for a long time. There's some interesting stuff, and I use that term loosely, with the planning reforms that were kind of published in draft in 2019, I think it was, when, or it might be 2020, when Gove was Minister for the Department of what's now Levelling Up. And there was some very worrying stuff in that, don't get me wrong. So zoning. But there was also quite a strong push on environmental resilience in, believe it or not, this term beauty. And I can imagine most people would find car parks difficult to describe as beautiful, although there are some exceptions. I think that will happen. I think possibly what may happen before that, will be less need for car parks. Car parks will become more valuable for building on. And then there's a question about how that development looks, how carbon light it is, etc., etc., etc. And that is bigger questions. At the moment, it's difficult to say. You know, we're all very familiar with the fact that the UK government is in a bit of a deregulatory mood, perhaps not quite as much as it was a month ago, but and with wildlife trusts and others through Wildlife and Countryside Link, so that would include WWT, WWF, RSPB, etc., Woodland Trust, are pushing for ever stronger protections, and also for positive interventions, because that was the problem. The problem with our current legislation for wildlife, it's about protecting from loss, and doesn't necessarily do that particularly well, loss or damage, rather than making it create a legal requirement to enhance and to increase, etc. And there's an element of that within the Environment Act, but it's by no means goes far enough. And again, I think there's a lot being hung on biodiversity again, and then also through the Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS, which was meant to replace the Common Agricultural Policy subsidies, which seems to again been kicked into the long grass. So it's difficult to say. I think, the broad environmental green alliance, however you describe it, is pushing for those kinds of things. But even, but that's again against a government which is still focused on growth in a very narrow definition of growth at the moment. So it's interesting that we haven't replicated what the Welsh government have. They enacted this law a few years ago called For Future Generations. So anything they do now cannot compromise future generations in their ability to live a comfortable life, whatever that means. We haven't got that yet. So that's something we're still collectively working with others to try and achieve.
Thank you, Matthew. That's so, you've given such kind of thoughtful, considered responses to people's questions. I thought that was the kind of the tone of your whole presentation as well. And that's kind of, people have commented in that in the chat, whether, it's made them reflect. But actually, you've kind of really considered the issues carefully and presented them in ways that I think will make people go away and kind of think. And obviously we're as they say, we're living in interesting times. But hopefully there are sort of positive ways forward. That's kind of, we have to kind of keep being hopeful, I think. We must wrap up now.